Alright, so it's time for the new build. This build is probably going to be goofier than the other ones that I've done so far. It's also a build that's probably not going to be for everyone, especially if you don't know who I'm trying to play as. And the tools that I use for the run are going to be somehow kind of based around him. So first off, we have the weapon that I'm going to be mainly using, which is going to be the ring finger. Now the reason I chose this weapon is because it kind of reminds me of the Moby Huge, and it's goofy as hell. And then for the Spirit Ashes, I'm going to be using the Wolf Summons to kind of relate to the pets that he has. And then I'll have two spells that I'll mainly use. They're going to be both the bubble spells, and the reason I chose them is just based off the name with Moist Critical and the fact that I can kind of use the FP bar as the Moist meter, so it's kind of like I'm using the Moist meter to create the bubbles, and I thought that fit pretty well. I was able to pick up both of the bubble spells in the Underground River. Alright, first spell acquired. Alright, perfect. After that, I went and picked up both pieces of the Dectus Medallion so that way I could get to Altus Plateau right away. Once I got to Altus Plateau, I went straight to Gelmir Hero's Cave so that way I could pick up the ring finger. In order to get to this weapon that's in the chest, you have to go through this lava pathway, and I actually learned from someone in the chat that backstepping through the lava is actually quicker than just rolling through it. After picking up the ring finger, I grabbed the Spirit Bell and the Wolf Summons. With all the items gathered, it was time to go fight Margit. This fight was super easy with the ring finger, and I thought of something while I was fighting him. I think it would be a good idea for the last hit on a boss to either come from one of the bubble spells or the claw flick ability from the ring finger. So I'm going to try to stick to that for as many bosses as I can. It's not to say that my wolves might be up at the end of one of the boss fights and end up killing the boss instead. After running past everything in Stormveil Castle, I got to Godrick, and I actually died a few times to him. I didn't have an upgraded weapon or upgraded anything at this point, so it was a bit harder than I thought it was going to be. I tried using my wolf summons, but they proved to be pretty much useless. Eventually I stopped just running in like an idiot. My main way of doing damage to him was jumping attacks, and I was also able to sprinkle in a few bubble spells as well. The bubbles weren't doing much, but it was a nice little bit of extra damage whenever he would just kind of walk into them. Second phase was a lot more the same, but I'd say it had a few easier attacks to punish on. I almost used up all my FP before I remembered that I wanted to beat as many bosses as I could with the finger flick. Easy. Didn't even need any upgrades. Alright, now would probably be a good time to go get that stuff though. After Godrick, I went around grabbing the Glovewort that I needed to upgrade my wolves, and then the Somber Smithing Stones I needed to upgrade my finger. After barely upgrading my weapon, I was just steamrolling bosses, flicking them left and right. Alright, I actually just flicked him to death. I was collecting so many easy levels all the way up to Renala. There we go.
What's a Moby Huge?
It's a 3-foot, 70-pound dildo. Well, dildo's the wrong word because you can't use it, so it's just like a 3-foot penis made out of silicone.
Nothing special with Renala's first phase, it was just taking the barrier down and getting the hits in when I could. Now the second phase is when the fight actually started, and she was getting her ass whooped. I summoned my wolves for this part, and they stagger her like crazy. They were interrupting her spells a majority of the fight. I actually say the wolves worked a little bit too well because I misjudged how much health she actually had left, and I went in for my flick and didn't kill her with it. Aw, man. I misjudged the amount of damage I would do. So instead of using the flick or a bubble to kill her, my wolf ended up finishing her off. After fighting Renala, I went around and fought more random bosses around the world. Most of the boss fights were still pretty easy, and they took a decent amount of damage from my weapon. Except for the Decay Dragon. He wasn't hard or anything, I still beat him in one try, but it took a lot longer than the other fights that I was doing. I noticed at this point that my weapon wasn't doing as much damage to the bosses at Caelid. And it was just hard to hit the dragon in general, mainly because I kept trying to go for his head. The downward swing I do with my weapon while I'm on horseback doesn't help with hitting a dragon's head that's right above me. Anyways, after killing the dragon, I thought it was time to go try to fight Radahn. And try as I might, I wasn't getting anything done. I only tried one time here, but I think that was enough for me to kind of decide that I should probably go fight more random bosses before actually trying to take on Radahn. I just wasn't doing that much damage to him. So I went around Caelid killing the bosses that gave the most runes, starting off with the giant sleeping dragon. Now I was not going to waste my time smacking the big one, especially when I don't have any sort of bleed in this build. So instead I opted to kill the actual smaller dragons. Then I went to go kill the flying dragon on the bridge and then the beefier putrid avatar. My flasks were pretty weak, so after killing the bosses, I went around Weeping Peninsula and picked up all the sacred tears that I could find. With my upgraded flasks, I felt comfortable going back and fighting Radahn. And this fight was definitely a challenge, much more than I thought it was going to be. I mean, I've beaten this dude just using Dragon Breath attacks, just using Thorn sorceries, and even only using throwing pots. So honestly, I thought using a melee weapon was going to be easy, one tap, GG go next, but that was not the case. I think it had to do with me not being too familiar with fighting Radahn with just melee weapons, and I kept misjudging the range of this melee. For some reason, it just seems off to me. Anyway, for the actual fight, I only really cared about trying to break Radahn's stance as much as I could, so I focused on, again, jumping attacks and heavy attacks. There. I must have been tilted after that Radahn fight because I spent the entirety of the next stream wiping out all the horse riding bosses that I could. Starting off, I went through Caria Manor to fight Loretta. Then I went back to the beginning area and fought the first Tree Sentinel. I knew I was going to be overleveled for this one, so I only used my wolf summons and the bubble spells, which at this point are still pretty bad. Next I went back to the plateau and fought the duo Tree Sentinel boss. Alright. And finally I went to fight the Draconic Tree Sentinel. This one was supposed to be more of a test. I figured I wasn't going to be doing a lot of damage, and sure enough I was not. I also used up all of my flasks before the boss had even gotten down to half health. I guess that's what I needed to wake up because I proceeded to finish the boss fight without taking another hit. Alright. I was feeling pretty good after that last half of that boss fight, and it kind of reminded me of my Sekiro no-hit attempts. But then I was reminded that I'm not allowed to feel good about myself, and this game is purely a skill issue. Oh my god, I'm so shit. Press B one too many times there. It was nice to know I wasn't alone though. What the fuck was that? I'm a decent way through the game, but I still feel like the character's not quite complete yet. I'm still looking for something that's kind of similar to a white shirt and black shorts. I was told that the cloth garb might be pretty good for a white shirt, so I went to Murkwater Cave to go grab it. After grabbing it, I realized this was a whole ass dress and was not going to fit the look. I'm not sure what in this game could come as close to just kind of like a plain white short sleeve shirt and black shorts, so it's probably just going to be wearing the starter outfit for the whole game. After that little failed excursion, I made it all the way to Golden Godfrey. And you know, this was another pretty easy fight. Nothing much to say here. I did decide to have a little bit more fun with this fight and prioritize using the Great Bubble spell instead of just my weapon. Oh yeah. Then of course, after fighting Golden Godfrey, I went directly to Morgott, who didn't let me beat him on the first try. Yeah, that was a bad roll. Though the next try went a lot smoother. Oh god. Bubble stronger than spear. After fighting Morgott, I realized I was still missing something from this build that kind of defines this character as critical. I was missing some type of yelling Ash of War. So I went back to the Knight in Limgrave and bought the Warcry Ash of War. And this skill will be in reference to Critical's screaming meme. Though I do have an issue with this skill. I thought I'd be able to use it and put the weapon away that had the skill on it, but I guess that's not the case. Whenever I would switch from my mace back to my staff, I noticed that the effect would go away. It also weirdly does this if I still have the mace technically equipped in my left hand, but I'm two-handing my finger. For some reason, the effect goes away then too. So if I really want to make use of the skill, I'm just going to have to switch over to the mace, use the skill, and then go back to one-handing my finger. Anyway, after adding that skill to my arsenal, I went over to the mountaintop area and took out another dragon. This dragon is never an issue, but I'm always annoyed at how much he uses his AoE roar. Next up, there was Fire Giant to deal with. And he actually gave me a decent amount of trouble. I tried to fight him a few times, but the damage just was not there. I think my +3 ring finger had taken me as far as it could, so it was time for an upgrade. I went around and gathered a few smithing stones so that way I could upgrade the ring finger to +6. With double the level, I felt like it was good to go back to Fire Giant. For this fight, I was pretty much just using strictly heavy attacks. The first phase didn't take too long, but the second phase definitely dragged on for a while. For the second phase, I pretty much just try to stay on his feet just because it's a lot safer compared to anywhere else on his body. I can avoid the rolling that he does a bit easier, but that also means that I do a lot less damage. The next boss on the list is Godskin Duo, but I knew with my current level I was not ready to fight them. I was level 86 at this point, and I felt like I needed a big boost to feel comfortable fighting them. So I took another break from powering through the main game bosses and went around killing a lot of optional bosses just for levels. I did this for about an hour and got to level 92. I felt like it was fine at this point to go back to the Godskin Duo. My build right now is mainly focused on the ring finger with just a splash of the bubble magic. I tried a few times without changing anything about this build, but it just didn't seem like the most viable way of fighting this duo. So after a couple failed attempts, I went back to Renala to change up the build. Instead of focusing on my melee weapon, I was going to go full magic instead. I basically took all my points out of strength and moved them all over to intelligence. After spending the one larval tier that I had, I kind of completely forgot that I didn't move any points over to my FP. I was super lazy, and instead of going to find another larval tier to correct my mistake, I kind of just said screw it and focused on using more of the Cerulean Flask instead. I've said time and time again throughout the other builds that I've been doing that I absolutely hate this boss. For this build, it wasn't any different and took me the better part of 2 hours to actually complete. The main damage of the fight was me getting safe behind pillars and charging up the Great Bubble as much as I could. If I'm locked onto an enemy as I cast the bubble, it tries to track that target as best as it can. Also, with its slow travel speed, I was usually able to cast that bubble safely behind a pillar, and eventually one of the bosses would come around that pillar and still get hit by the bubble. It was also great for me when they were super close together because the explosion from the bubble can damage both of them at the same time, doing over like 1000 damage. Once the big man got to half health and started rolling all over the place, I pretty much just crossed my fingers and hoped that he wouldn't roll over the destroyed pillar, and if he was stuck there, I would use that time to get in as many bubbles as I could. Once he was down, I focused on the skinny guy, but I wasn't able to kill him before he re-summoned the other one. From here, the fight turned into a long game of only attacking on the safest of moves. Eventually, after several minutes, I almost threw the fight. I ended up being one shot, and so did the boss. Luckily, I was able to dodge their follow-up attacks and finish it off with one more bubble. I ended that fight with 4 HP. Malekith was handled pretty easily due to the things that I learned in the last fight. I start off using my wolves so they can act as a distraction and pull aggro as much as possible. From there, I pretty much fight him just like I fought the Godskin Duo. I use the pillars to my advantage and try to get the bubbles to maneuver around them a little bit. Most of the time I don't even actually need to lock onto the boss. I can kind of just decide either left or right of the pillar based on where he's close to and just lock off, shoot one, and eventually he comes around the pillar and gets hit by it. Then I just continue the pillar strat for the rest of the first phase. I felt like Malekith was too fast in the second phase, so instead of trying to continue the pillar strat, I swapped to just counterattacking on a couple of his combos. A lot of his big combos have a nice cooldown at the end of them that allow me to actually use the bubble spell without the chance of being hit.
In the story here, the lady was able to get the candle outside before like the nuclear explosion, so she was able to save the house and everyone inside of it. But man, what a wild terrorist attack from Gwyneth Paltrow here with the candle, huh?
After Malekith was taken care of course I went straight to Gideon. All I did this fight was spam my bubble spells the whole time. Gideon really couldn't do much against this. Then I needed to get the prep work done to fight pretty much the hardest bosses all in a row at the end like I usually do. So next up I needed to go to Commander Nile. I was still spec to my magic build, so I wasn't using my finger that much in these fights. My large bubble was my main source of damage, and I could really only use one between the attacks that he was doing. So the fight took quite a bit longer than I thought it was going to. I'm pretty far into the game at this point, but my wolves are still only +3, so I spent some time gathering around more Glovewort to get them all the way up to +9. With my wolves up to par, I went to go fight Mohg. I'm still spec'd for bubbles, so I used my newly upgraded wolves to act as distractions again. They did a good job pulling aggro in that first phase, allowing me to pretty much just spam bubbles from a distance without taking almost any damage. Once the second phase started, my wolves were down for the count, so it was just me and Mohg at this point. I was a lot more defensive for the remainder of the fight, trying to create as much distance as possible between us, which opened up the opportunity to continue using my bubble spells. With my change in stats in the endgame, I'm starting to like the bubble spells a lot more. I had a kind of weird time fighting Godfrey. I was getting pretty annoyed fighting him and died a few times, but once I finally figured out the concrete strat that I was going to use and actually ended up beating him, I kind of looked back on it and thought it was easier than I was making it. Immediately after ending the fog gate, I start blasting my bubbles at him. With my current FP bar, I can shoot 5 of the big bubbles. It's timed out pretty perfectly and he ends up just walking into all of them. With this, I can do over 3k damage off rip. Then once all 5 of the bubbles hit, he's usually right on top of me, so I just run away to the opposite side exactly where he came from. Then I just continue shooting the big bubbles until he gets close to me again. It takes only about 2 volleys of this until he actually transitions into the stomping phase. Once he starts stomping around, I have nowhere near enough time to continue using my bubble spells. So I swap to using my melee weapon and stay in close to him. When he uses his Earth Shatter move, I can at least get out of the range of that and charge up a bubble, but other than that, I'm really just melee him for the rest of this phase. A mistake that I kept doing at the start of the second phase was summoning my wolves right away. A lot of times, not that long after the second phase starts, he goes into his Earth Shatter move again, and this move completely decimates my wolves. I really want to use them as a distraction, so I need them alive for as long as possible. So instead of summoning them right away at the start of the phase, I waited until he used that Earth Shatter move once and then summoned the wolves right after. Then from here I got a lot more defensive, really only attacking when he was aggroed on my wolves. Then I got a little crazy at the end after my wolves died and probably took a few shots that weren't too smart, but it ended up paying off. After Godfrey, I went to the Haligtree and fought Loretta. Now Loretta's very strong against magic, so I was kind of worried that my build wasn't going to be good against her, but she was easy. Again, the wolves were a good distraction, and I just spammed the Great Bubble when I could. We're getting close to the end of the playthrough, and of course that means fighting Malenia. Just like the Bride of Thorns playthrough, this first phase was super easy. Malenia is made to dodge right when a spell is cast, so when you're using a very slow moving spell like the Great Bubble, she's dodging nothing pretty much. It moves so slow that she goes back to just slowly walking towards you and eventually gets hit by the bubble anyway. All I had to do for this first phase was create enough distance between us and just keep using my bubble spells. The only move I had to worry about was her waterfowl dance, and again, no issue dodging that as long as I had a nice amount of distance between us. The strat definitely changed in the second phase though. Once she gets done using her first flower move, I can use a Great Bubble and get a little bit of damage off then. But after that, she's no longer like walking slow towards me. She kind of jogs at me, so I don't really have much time to use my bubble spell anymore. When I do have time to actually use my Great Bubble, she's jumping around all over the place, so it makes it a lot harder to actually hit her. So instead of relying on my Great Bubble like I did in the first phase, I opted to use my finger weapon instead. There's a certain move that she does that I felt was great for me to counter on. It's whenever she slams down to create a Scarlet Geyser. After rolling through the slam, I charge up the finger flick attack and knock her down. This was a pretty safe move, so I just focused on dodging everything else, and whenever she did that, then that's when I would attack. Eventually her health got down to the point where she uses her flower attack again, and while she was recovering from that, I go ahead and use my Great Bubble again. But other than that, it's just a finger flick for the second phase. For most of this playthrough, I was debating if I should even fight Rykard. The boss is perfectly fine when you're using the intended weapon that's in the room, but for the goofy builds that I've been doing, they're not the best at dealing with his large health pool. I gave it a few tries anyway, and I'm glad that I did. For about this entire playthrough, I've really just been using the ring finger and the Great Bubble. The smaller multiple bubbles have really taken a back seat until this boss. Both bubble spells seem to do a nice amount of poise damage, but the smaller multiple ones do way better during this first phase. It only takes a few casts for him to get stunned, and once he does, I run up to where his head's gonna land and start whacking away at it. This method allows me to conserve a decent amount of FP flasks for the second phase, which I'll definitely need. There wasn't really any strategy that I tried to do for the second phase. When I wasn't running away from his tracking skulls, I just spent the other time throwing bubbles at him. It's good that I tried to conserve as much as possible in the first phase, because I had just enough to finish the fight for the second phase. I still obviously had my finger if I did run an FP before then, but I'd rather play it safe than having to repeat the fight and chip away at his health again. I enjoyed the first phase of this fight a lot more than the second one for sure. Before taking on the final boss, I had went back to Rennala and switched my build back to being melee focused. I really wish I had more to say about this fight, but I kind of just walked in there and beat them. I thought it was going to be trial and error of a few strategies and me having to repeat the fight a few times, but I didn't have to. I bubbled for about the first half of his health and then switched to melee for the rest. For Elden Beast, I try to stay as close to him as possible and strictly use melee for this fight. When I was close to him, I wanted to use as many strong attacks as I could to try to break his posture. Other than that, I was just trying to do as much damage as I could.
Woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about.
The Moist Critical run is finally done, and I really enjoyed that run. I thought it was fun. Appreciate everyone watching the videos and hope to see you again.